So our notes today are the final section of Chapter 3, Section 4, which is on matter cycling. And today I just want to focus on two different substances that are very important, water and carbon. The other one that we will be covering is nitrogen, but I will do that in a separate set of notes. So we follow along with me, and I'm going to start with just talking about matter cycles in general, then I'm going to do water, and then I'll talk about carbon. Substances in nature are not destroyed. As you guys probably have learned in your life, matter can neither be created nor destroyed. It just changes form. So for example, when you boil water, it's going from liquid to a gas. It didn't disappear. It's just changing its state. So substances in nature are not destroyed. They just change forms. All ecosystems have substances that change forms as the substances interact with the ecosystem. And this matter, the movement of matter is called a cycle. So all of these will be called matter cycles. That's because the matter will change forms over and over again, sometimes cycling back to the original form that it was in. And again, I'll cover that in just a minute. It'll all make sense at the end. So substances can change forms indefinitely over time. So key points here: matter is cycled, but energy is not cycled. It is either transferred on to the next trophic level, or, as we learned in our last section, is lost as heat waste. And that's the 10% rule. 10% is transferred, and with every movement from trophic level to trophic level, 90% of the energy is lost. I really like this little picture below because it gives you an idea of how energy is moving in a one-way pattern, and matter is cycling. So if you look over here, which they have in orange, the sun provides energy to producers, which in turn are then consumed, and then energy is lost along the way, 90%. 10% being transferred. But matter is constantly being cycled through the environment, moving from plant to animal, to the ground, to the atmosphere, and so on and so forth. Now, the first matter cycle we're going to cover is the water cycle. And it's very possible that you learned the water cycle in middle school or maybe even earlier. Water can move through an ecosystem in three major forms: liquid, gas, and solid. I'm going to verbally go over the steps of the water cycle, but there is a picture after I finish, and it sums up what I'm about to show you really nicely, and I'll go over that in a minute. When liquid water turns into gas, usually due to solar energy, that's called evaporation. However, instead of just evaporating, liquid water can also turn to a gas by moving through plants, and that has its own name. That is called transpiration. So how that works is if you have a plant, when water moves into the roots and goes up into the leaves, typically it's being used for photosynthesis. But any extra water can leave through the stomata, if you guys remember that, as gas, and then end up in the atmosphere, and that's called transpiration. In the atmosphere, gaseous water will begin to stick together as water molecules attract to one another through cohesion, and eventually they become liquid again. So that is called condensation. And you can see condensation when you've got a cold drink on a warm day. The water in the air that's in the form of a gas will begin to clump together and become liquid again, and then that forms condensation on your cup. Eventually that condensation becomes so heavy and falls back down to the ground as rain or snow or sleet, and that's called precipitation. When precipitation runs down hills and mountains and other earth structures, for lack of a better term, but possibly picking up things along the way, like fertilizers, like bits of soil, that's called runoff. And runoff can cause problems if it has too much sediment or too much fertilizer dissolved in it. If it ends up in bodies of water, it can create problems for ecosystems. And then finally, groundwater is when you get water seeping through the surface of the earth and eventually hitting some sort of impervious rock. And that allows for water to kind of sit there and be either taken back up by humans by drilling wells or by taken in by plants. So this whole, Roman numeral, whatever I was doing, Roman numeral 2, is summed up in this picture right here. You've got transpiration, water moving through plants. You've got precipitation, condensation, evaporation, runoff, groundwater. You also might want to note a couple of things. Infiltration and percolation are when water is kind of moving through the soil. So those are a couple of extra terms right there. So that's the water cycle. Now the next cycle is the carbon cycle, and that is an example of a nutrient cycle. So these are things like carbon and phosphorus, and we're not going to be covering phosphorus in this class, but these are elements that help build the macromolecules of the body. So remember, these are elements that build tissues and carry out life functions. Carbon, and we're going to be covering nitrogen later, are two nutrient cycles that are very important. Both of these are in all of the macromolecules of the body. Carbon is in all of the macromolecules of the body. Nitrogen is in protein and nucleic acids, but not in lipids and carbohydrates. So starting with the carbon cycle. Carbon is a key element in living tissue. Remember CHO, CHON, CHOMP, if you guys remember when we did our macromolecules. proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. Have carbon. Carbon and oxygen form carbon dioxide gas through cellular respiration. So we're going to start there. If CO2 is in the atmosphere, what could happen next? Well, first of all, plants take in carbon dioxide through, and you guys know this, photosynthesis. And they make sugar. And if you forgot what that was, C6H12O6, glucose. What would happen next is animals eat plants and each other through consumption or consuming. And consuming will move the carbon into higher organisms like animals. Both plants and animals respire. And that actually puts the CO2 right back into the atmosphere. So photosynthesis and respiration are their own little cycle. So that is kind of one cycle. However, it's not that simple anymore because humans have also started doing processes that have affected the carbon cycle, and I'll get to that in just a second. Carbon dioxide is concentrated in certain parts of the earth. One is the ocean. It's dissolved in the ocean. And respiration and photosynthesis also occur because there are photosynthetic organisms in the ocean that turn carbon into sugars there, and then organisms eat that. Organisms die and decompose, whether it's in the ocean or on Earth, on the soil. And when organisms die, one possibility is over millions of years, if their bodies get covered with sediment and compressed, they can be turned into fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are another concentrated source of carbon on Earth. Now, what humans have done is we have tapped into these fossil fuels as an energy source, and we burn them. And burning them rapidly puts the carbon back into the atmosphere. That is called combustion. So if you look at the picture down here, this just kind of sums up everything I've talked about. Respiration and photosynthesis are their own cycle. Carbon dioxide is found dissolved in the ocean, and it can dissolve into the water and then come back out of solution back into the atmosphere. When organisms die, they end up in the soil, and through rock formation and sedimentation, they can turn into fossil fuels. And fossil fuels can then be burned, which they don't use the word combustion, they use just burning, which puts carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So the issue with human activities is combustion is very, very rapidly getting higher and higher. And unfortunately, photosynthesis, which is one major way to take carbon out of the atmosphere, is going down with deforestation. And so overall, the CO2 levels on Earth are rising. And that is creating global climate change.